A mountain man saved a dying native child. But the next day, 300 warriors surrounded his cabin. He thought he was doing a simple act of mercy, pulling a fevered boy in from the snow. But one night of kindness turned into a storm of danger. Now, outside his door, the ground shakes with hooves and war cries. Warriors believe the child was stolen. The army believes war is coming. And the man in the middle? He's torn between death at their hands or proving the truth through courage no one expects. The child whispers one word that could save him: brother. But is that enough to stop the blood from spilling? When mercy is mistaken for betrayal and two worlds stand ready for war, can one broken man's faith bridge the divide? Or will his cabin become his grave? Your comments remind me that we're not alone in feeling deeply. If loyalty, second chances, and human dignity mean something to you, then you're right where you belong. The wind howled through the Colorado pines, driving snow against the lone cabin's walls. Inside, Mateo Hale stirred a pot of beans with a wooden spoon, the lamplight casting long shadows across rough-hewn floorboards. The beans had been simmering since sundown, their simple aroma filling the small space. He glanced at the shuttered windows, frost creeping along their edges. The winter of 1879 had been merciless, even by mountain standards. Mateo pulled his wool coat tighter and settled onto a three-legged stool by the fire. Out of habit, more than faith, he bowed his head. "Lord," he began, then fell silent. The words wouldn't come anymore, hadn't for years, not since Sarah and little Thomas. His spoon scraped the bottom of his tin plate. The fire popped and hissed, throwing sparks up the stone chimney. Then came the pounding, desperate fists against his door, so sudden it made him jump. Mateo's hand found his rifle. In these mountains, unexpected visitors rarely meant good news. The pounding came again, weaker this time. He moved cautiously to the door, rifle ready. "Who's there?" No answer came, just the moaning wind. Mateo unbarred the door and pulled it open. Cold air rushed in, along with swirling snow, and a small body collapsed across his threshold. A native boy, no more than 10 years old, lay face down in rags that might once have been clothes. His dark hair was crusted with ice, lips blue as the winter sky. "Good Lord," Mateo breathed. Without hesitation, he propped his rifle against the wall and scooped up the boy. The child weighed almost nothing in his arms, like carrying a bundle of sticks wrapped in wet cloth. He laid the boy near the fire, fingers fumbling as he stripped away the frozen rags. The child's skin burned with fever despite the cold, his shallow breathing raspy and uneven. Mateo covered him with his best fur blankets, the ones he'd traded 3 deer hides to get last summer. "Stay with me, boy," he murmured, though he wasn't sure the child could hear. "Just stay with me." Memories rose unbidden, another small body burning with fever, another night of desperate prayer. Thomas had been only 6 when the sickness took him, Sarah following just days later. Mateo pushed the thoughts away. This time would be different. He set water to boil and dug through his stores for willow bark. The tea would help with both fever and pain if he could get the boy to drink. While it steeped, he wrung out a cloth in cool water and bathed the child's face and neck. "That's it. Breathe easy now," he encouraged, as the boy's breathing steadied slightly. The rattling in his chest still worried Mateo. He'd heard that sound before, knew how quickly it could turn deadly. Hour after hour, Mateo kept his vigil. He spooned willow bark tea between the boy's cracked lips, changed cool compresses, and stoked the fire until the cabin was almost too warm for comfort. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside this small space, Mateo fought a different kind of battle. When the boy shivered violently despite the heat, Mateo pulled him into his arms, sharing his own warmth. It had been so long since he'd held anyone, the contact felt strange at first. But as the hours wore on, something in his chest began to thaw. "I had a boy about your age once," He found himself whispering in the dark hours before dawn. Name was Thomas. Reckon he'd have wanted me to help you if he was here. His voice cracked on the words. The boy stirred slightly, pressing closer to the warmth. His breathing, though still labored, had grown stronger. Mateo touched the child's forehead, still hot, but not the burning heat of before. As first light crept through the shutters, the boy's eyes fluttered open. Dark eyes, fever bright but aware, met Mateo's. Fear flickered across the young face, but Mateo kept his voice gentle. You're safe here, boy. I ain't gonna hurt you. He reached for the cup of willow bark tea. Think you can drink a little more? The child's fingers trembled as they wrapped around the cup, but he managed a few sips before exhaustion pulled him back into sleep. This time, though, it was real sleep, not the heavy unconsciousness of before. Mateo eased him back onto the bedding, tucking the furs close. Whatever had driven this child to his door, whatever troubles waited outside, could wait. For now, it was enough that death had been cheated of another young life. He added more wood to the fire and settled back to watch over his unexpected guest. The morning light grew stronger, but the snow showed no signs of letting up. Mateo didn't mind. For the first time in years, his cabin didn't feel quite so empty. Dawn crept over the mountains, painting the cabin's frost-covered windows with pale light. Mateo's muscles ached from sitting up all night, but he couldn't bring himself to leave the boy's side. The child's breathing had steadied through the dark hours, though a faint wheeze still caught in his chest. As morning light filled the cabin, the boy stirred. His eyes fluttered open, clearer now than they'd been in the night. His cracked lips moved, forming words too quiet to hear. Mateo leaned closer. What's that, boy? Tawa, the child whispered. I am called Tawa. His voice was weak but carried dignity beyond his years. My father is Naiche, leader of our people. Apache. Mateo had suspected as much from the boy's features and what remained of his clothing. He nodded slowly. I'm Mateo Hale. You're safe here, Tawa. The boy's eyes drifted closed again, but his breathing remained steady. Mateo wrapped another blanket around his thin shoulders before moving to the fireplace. He ladled hot broth from the pot he'd kept simmering through the night, letting it cool slightly before bringing it to Tawa. Think you can manage some of this? He asked softly. Tawa nodded, accepting the cup with trembling hands. Mateo helped him hold it steady as he sipped. Each swallow seemed to bring more strength back to the boy's face. After Tawa had taken what he could, Mateo stepped outside. The storm had passed, leaving the world wrapped in pristine white. Morning sunlight sparkled across untouched snow that stretched down into the valley. The silence felt absolute, broken only by the occasional crack of a snow-laden branch. His eyes caught on tracks in the snow near the cabin, not Tawa's stumbling trail from the night before, but others. Multiple sets, partially filled by the storm. Mateo studied them carefully. Someone had been searching, but the heavy snowfall had forced them to turn back. The woodpile needed tending. Mateo grabbed his axe, the familiar weight comfortable in his hands. As he worked, splitting logs with practiced swings, his thoughts churned. The boy needed care, but his people would be searching. The tracks worried him. They could belong to Apache searchers or to soldiers who sometimes patrolled these mountains. By midday, warm sunlight had begun to soften the snow's crust. Mateo carried an armload of split wood inside to find Tawa sitting up, propped against the wall. Color had returned to the boy's face, though exhaustion still marked his features. Let me check those cuts, Mateo said, setting down the wood. He gathered clean cloths and the jar of salve he'd made from pine resin and herbs. As he cleaned the scratches on Tawa's arms and face, likely from pushing through thorny brush in the storm, Mateo found himself humming. It took him a moment to recognize the tune. Amazing Grace, Sarah's favorite hymn. He hadn't sung it since her passing. Tawa watched him work with dark, thoughtful eyes. The boy didn't flinch when the salve stung, just observed Mateo's movements with quiet trust. Something about that trust made Mateo's throat tighten. The short winter day faded quickly. As dusk gathered outside the cabin windows, Mateo sat at his rough-hewn table, watching Tawa sleep. The boy's fever had broken, and his breathing was clearer. He would live. But what then? The right thing would be to help him return to his people as soon as he was strong enough. The Apache camps couldn't be more than 2 days' ride away. But the thought of sending the child back into the dangerous winter mountains made Mateo's chest ache. He'd already lost one boy to forces beyond his control. When darkness fell completely, Mateo lit the lamp and added wood to the fire. The familiar tasks felt different somehow, as if the cabin itself had changed. It felt warmer, more alive with another soul within its walls. Before settling down to sleep, Mateo knelt beside his bed. For the first time in years, words came easily to his lips. "Thank you, Lord," he whispered, "for letting me save him." The prayer felt rusty, unpracticed, but sincere. His faith might be as broken as he was, but gratitude filled his heart. One small life had been spared, and that was enough for now. He glanced at Tawa's sleeping form, peaceful in the lamplight. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but for this moment, in this quiet cabin, there was healing for both the boy and the man who had found him. The next morning dawned crisp and bright. Mateo woke before sunrise, his muscles stiff from sleeping in his chair. He stoked the dying embers and added fresh logs until flames crackled in the fireplace. Tawa still slept soundly, his breathing stronger than the day before. Grabbing his axe, Mateo stepped out into the biting morning air. Fresh snow had fallen overnight, softening the tracks he'd seen yesterday. He trudged to the woodpile, his boots crunching through the frozen crust. The familiar rhythm of splitting logs helped clear his mind, each stroke precise and purposeful. When he returned to the cabin, arms loaded with fresh-cut wood, he found Tawa sitting up against the wall. The boy's eyes were brighter, more alert than they'd been since Mateo found him. "You are kind to help me," Tawa said softly, accepting a cup of steaming broth. His hands were steadier now as he raised it to his lips. "Any man would do the same," Mateo replied, though he wondered if that was true. "My people," Tawa started, then paused to catch his breath. "They will be searching." "I reckon they are," Mateo agreed, settling into his chair. "When you're stronger, we'll—" A distant rumble cut him off. At first he thought it was thunder, but the sound grew steadier, more rhythmic. Hoofbeats, many hoofbeats. Mateo moved to the window, pushing aside the heavy curtain. His heart stopped. Riders were pouring into the snow-covered meadow before his cabin, their horses' breath steaming in the cold air. More appeared from the trees, until the valley seemed to fill with mounted warriors. Their faces were painted for war, weapons ready. 300, at least, he muttered, counting quickly. Each rider carried either a rifle or a bow, and their expressions spoke of deadly purpose. From their midst, a commanding figure urged his horse forward. The chief sat tall in his saddle, his face stern with grief and rage. Even without Tawa's earlier words, Mateo would have known this was Nietzsche, the boy's father. The resemblance was clear in the set of his jaw, the proud bearing. "Bring out my son," Nietzsche's voice boomed across the snow. "Face your judgment, kidnapper." Shouts rose from the warriors, some calling for immediate vengeance, others counseling patience. Their horses stamped restlessly, steam rising from their flanks. Mateo glanced at Tawa, who struggled to rise but fell back, too weak to stand. The boy's eyes were wide with recognition and concern. "Father," he tried to call out, but his voice was barely a whisper. Mateo's rifle stood in the corner, within easy reach. One shot might buy him time to escape through the back door, lose himself in the wilderness he knew so well. But that would only confirm their worst fears, mark him as guilty in their eyes. Number. There was only one way through this. "I'm coming out," he called clearly. "I mean no harm." Mateo opened his door slowly and stepped into the snow. He kept his hands visible, empty at his sides. The morning sun cast long shadows across the valley as warriors tightened their circle around him. Their eyes burned with barely contained fury. "Where is my son?" Nietzsche demanded, his horse pawing the ground. "Safe inside," Mateo replied steadily. "I found him 2 nights ago, half frozen in the storm. He's been sick with fever, but he's healing." "You expect us to believe you helped him?" A warrior spat the words. "White men don't help Apache children." More angry shouts rose. Some warriors raised their weapons. The circle drew tighter, hooves crushing the snow around Mateo. "I expect you to believe what's true," Mateo said, keeping his voice calm, though his heart raced. "The boy was dying. I couldn't let that happen, not again." The last words slipped out before he could stop them, raw with old grief. Nietzsche studied him intently, reading something in Mateo's face. The chief raised his hand, and the shouts died away. "You lost a child," Nietzsche stated. It wasn't a question. Mateo nodded, his throat tight. "A son, and his mother. The fever took them both." The silence stretched, broken only by the creak of leather and the snort of horses. Snow began to fall again, soft flakes catching in the warriors' hair and on their horses' manes. "Show me my son," Nietzsche commanded finally, swinging down from his horse. 2 warriors moved to follow, but he waved them back. "I will see for myself what kind of man saves an enemy's child." The chief's dark eyes bored into Mateo as he gestured toward the cabin door. "Show me my son. Now." Mateo nodded slowly, keeping his movements deliberate. "Tawa," he called over his shoulder, not daring to turn his back on the armed warriors. "Can you come to the door, boy?" The cabin fell silent. Every warrior seemed to hold their breath, waiting. After what felt like hours, the door creaked. Tawa appeared, gripping the doorframe for support. His face was pale, his legs trembling with the effort of standing. "Father," he whispered, the word barely carrying across the snow. Nietzsche's expression flickered between relief and rage as he took in his son's weakness. The boy tried to speak again, to explain, but a coughing fit doubled him over. He slumped against the doorframe, clearly exhausted by even this small effort. "Look what they have done to my son!" a warrior shouted. Others took up the cry. Bows creaked as arrows were drawn. Rifle hammers clicked back. "No!" Tawa tried to protest, but his voice was too weak to carry over the angry shouts. Mateo knew how it looked. The boy too frail to defend him, perhaps appearing drugged or mistreated. The truth would die with him if he couldn't prove it somehow. He raised his voice to be heard over the warriors. "I submit myself to your justice." The words rang across the meadow. "Test me however you wish. I'll prove I meant only to help your son." The shouting died away. Nietzsche raised one hand for silence, studying Mateo with new intensity. "You would submit to Apache trial? Few white men survive our tests of truth." "I don't fear death," Mateo replied steadily, "but I won't die with you believing I harmed a child." Snow fell harder now, white flakes catching in Nietzsche's long black hair as he considered. Finally, he nodded. "So be it. At sundown, you will face our trial. If you speak truth, you may live. If you lie..." He left the threat unspoken. "Father, please." Tawa tried again, but Nietzsche gestured for 2 warriors to help the boy back inside. "Rest, my son," the chief said more gently. "Your strength will return, and tonight we will know the truth of this man's heart." The hours crawled by like wounded things. Mateo remained under guard, watching the sun sink toward the western peaks. He used the time to pray, not for survival, but for understanding between peoples. The old words came easier now than they had in years. As the last light faded from the sky, warriors bound Mateo's wrists with rawhide strips. They led him to the edge of the meadow, where others had gathered dry wood and kindling. Soon, a ring of torches blazed against the gathering dark, casting wild shadows across the snow. The warriors formed a circle. Some began a low chant that seemed to vibrate in Mateo's bones. The sound grew stronger as more voices joined, rising and falling like wind through canyon walls. Drums began to pulse, matching the rhythm of Mateo's pounding heart. Naiche stepped into the firelight, his face painted with symbols Mateo didn't understand. "You will face 3 tests," he announced. "Each will bring pain. Each will reveal truth or lies in your spirit. Are you prepared?" Mateo nodded, his throat too dry for words. The chanting grew louder, and more torches flared to life. Through the flames, he caught a glimpse of Tawa watching from the cabin door, worry clear on his young face. Taking a deep breath, Mateo closed his eyes. His lips moved in one final prayer, not for deliverance, but for the strength to endure whatever came next. The drums thundered louder, and the first test began. The night wind howled across the meadow like a hungry wolf. Mateo's teeth chattered as he stood tied to a weathered post, his shirt offering little protection against the bitter cold. His wrists, bound above his head, had long since gone numb. Each gust cut through him like a knife of ice. Warriors ringed the clearing, silent as stone. Their faces flickered in the torchlight, watching, waiting. Some stood motionless for hours, while others took turns tending small fires that offered no warmth to the prisoner. The drums had fallen silent, but their echo still pulsed in Mateo's blood. As midnight approached, exhaustion dragged at his legs. He fought to stay upright, knowing that to fall would mean failure. His mind wandered to darker times, to the fever that had taken his wife and son 5 years ago. He remembered holding little Thomas as the boy's life slipped away, remembered the bitterness that had driven him deep into these mountains. "Was it worth it?" he whispered through cracked lips. The cold had reached his bones now, making every breath a struggle. Was saving one child worth dying for? The answer came not in words, but in memory. Tawa's trust as Mateo tended his fever, the boy's weak grip on his hand, the flash of life returning to young eyes. It was worth everything. Hours crawled by. Mateo's legs buckled once, twice, but each time he forced himself straight again. The warriors murmured at his strength, though their faces remained stern. Near dawn, darkness took him briefly, his head slumped forward, consciousness fading. "Stand!" A sharp voice cut through his haze. Mateo jerked awake, muscles screaming as he straightened. He blinked, trying to focus on the figure approaching through the pre-dawn gloom. A woman in a dark dress hurried across the snow, her breath clouding in the frigid air. Sarah Callahan, the missionary's widow who lived near the Apache camp. She spoke rapidly to Chief Naiche in the Apache tongue, gesturing toward Mateo with obvious concern. "This man is known to me," she said in English, turning to address both the chief and the watching warriors. "He has traded fairly with our mission for years. Never once has he shown cruelty or dishonesty." Naiche listened with respect, but shook his head. "Your words carry weight, Widow Callahan, but this is a matter of my son. Only Tawa's testimony can free him." Sarah's face fell, but she nodded, understanding. She approached Mateo, touching his arm gently. "Hold fast," she whispered. "God has not abandoned you here." Mateo managed a weak nod, though he wasn't sure about God anymore. Sarah withdrew, but her presence had given him strength. As the eastern sky began to pale, he focused on staying upright, one breath at a time. The sunrise painted the mountains gold, then touched the meadow with pale light. Warriors who had watched through the night straightened, noting Mateo's endurance with growing respect. He had not begged, had not cursed them, had not fallen. Even those who had called loudest for his death now spoke in hushed tones. "He stands like Apache," one warrior observed. "The night was bitter," another added. "Many would have broken." Nietzsche himself approached as the sun cleared the horizon. He studied Mateo's face, noting the glazed eyes and blue-tinged lips, but also the straight spine and steady gaze. The chief's expression softened slightly. "You have shown courage," he said. "Few white men would face our justice with such strength." Mateo could barely form words through his frozen jaw. "A father's love deserves truth," he managed. Something flickered in Nietzsche's dark eyes, recognition, perhaps, or memory. He opened his mouth to speak again, but a commotion from the cabin drew every eye. Tawa had emerged, wrapped in furs. 2 warriors supported him as he shuffled forward through the snow. The boy's face was still pale with fever, but his eyes were clear now. He looked from his father to Mateo and back, determination written across his young features. Every warrior in the clearing held their breath, waiting. The trial of endurance was complete, but Mateo's fate still hung by a thread. Only the boy's word could tip the balance between life and death. Dawn's light spread across the snow-covered meadow as father and son faced each other, the moment of truth finally at hand. Inside Mateo's cabin, warmth from the crackling fire pushed back the morning chill. Tawa sat propped against a wall of rough-hewn logs, wrapped in thick furs. Color had returned to his cheeks, and his eyes were bright with awareness. Chief Nietzsche knelt beside his son, touching the boy's forehead with gentle fingers. "Tell me true, my son," Nietzsche said in Apache. "What happened when you were lost?" Tawa's voice came stronger than before. "The storm caught me gathering pine nuts. I could not find my way. The cold ... He shuddered at the memory. "I saw light through the trees. This man," he gestured to Mateo. "He pulled me from death's door. He gave me medicine, warm furs, good soup." Nietzsche's face remained stern. A child's word alone cannot settle such grave matters. There must be more proof. Sarah Callahan moved quietly through the cabin, her dark dress rustling as she approached Mateo. "May we speak outside?" she asked softly. They stepped onto the porch, where 2 warriors kept watchful guard. The morning sun glinted off fresh snow, nearly blinding in its brightness. Sarah lowered her voice, concern etching her features. "There's trouble brewing," she warned. "Word has spread about the Apache gathering here. Settlers are nervous, and soldiers from the fort are asking questions. Some fear this is a war party." Mateo rubbed his raw wrists where the ropes had cut them. "What can be done?" "Be cautious," Sarah advised. "These are dangerous times. One spark could set off more violence than anyone wants." She touched his arm gently. "I've seen your heart these past years, Mateo. You're a good man, though you try to hide it. Perhaps God led you to this moment." Mateo looked away, uncomfortable with her faith in him. Before he could respond, Chief Nietzsche appeared in the doorway. "You are released from the post," he announced, "but you will remain under guard until the council decides your fate." His dark eyes held Mateo's. "Do not attempt to flee. It would go badly." As evening approached, shadows lengthened across the cabin floor. The warriors outside had built their own fires, their voices carrying faintly through the walls. Inside, Sarah helped Mateo prepare a simple supper of beans and cornbread. His muscles ached from the night's ordeal, making every movement stiff. "Funny," Mateo said quietly as they ate. "Spent 5 years avoiding people, trying to forget. Now here I am, right in the middle of their judgment again." He stirred his beans absently. "After Thomas died, I couldn't bear being around others. Their pity felt like poison." Sarah nodded, understanding. "Grief can make us build high walls, but sometimes God sends someone to break them down." She glanced at Tawa, who dozed by the fire. The boy had insisted on staying in the cabin, though his father's warriors had prepared a proper Apache shelter outside. He lay curled in furs near the hearth, his breathing deep and even. As Mateo watched, Tawa shifted in his sleep. "Brother," the boy murmured softly in English, the word clear despite his accent. "Brother Mateo." Something caught in Mateo's throat. He looked away quickly, but not before Sarah saw the moisture in his eyes. She reached across the table and squeezed his hand. "The boy sees true," she said. "Whatever walls we build, love finds a way through." Mateo didn't trust himself to speak. Instead, he rose and added another log to the fire. Its warmth seemed to reach deeper now, past the physical cold, touching something long frozen in his heart. He stood watching the flames dance, listening to Tawa's steady breathing and the distant songs of the Apache camp. The word brother echoed in his mind, spoken in a child's trusting voice. After so many years of choosing solitude, of turning away from human connections, that simple word felt like the first crack in a dam. Mateo wasn't sure whether to welcome or fear the emotions threatening to break through. Sarah gathered their empty bowls, humming softly, an old hymn about God's mercy. Outside, the guards maintained their vigil as night settled over the mountain valley. Tomorrow would bring the tribal council's judgment, but for now, in this moment, an unlikely family had formed in the firelight: a hardened mountain man, a missionary widow, and an Apache chief's son who saw past all boundaries to name the truth in his heart. Dawn broke harsh and cold over the mountain valley. Frost glittered on pine needles as warriors gathered in tight clusters, their breath steaming in the bitter air. The younger men gestured sharply, voices rising with anger as they debated Mateo's fate. "Why do we wait?" demanded one warrior, no older than 20 summers. "He took our chief's son. Our law is clear." Others nodded in agreement, hands tightening on weapon hafts. But Grey Wolf, an elder whose face bore the lines of many winters, raised his hand for peace. He stood the night trial without breaking. There is honor in such strength. The old man's eyes settled on Mateo, who sat quietly by his cabin door, watching the debate unfold. "Honor means nothing if he harmed the boy," another young brave shouted. The argument swelled again, threatening to boil over into violence. Mateo rose slowly, his muscles still aching from the night at the post. He approached Chief Nietzsche, who observed the growing discord with narrowed eyes. Warriors fell silent, hands moving to weapons. "Let me prove my truth," Mateo said, keeping his voice steady. "I'll ride with you to your winter camp. No ropes, no bonds. If I meant harm, I would run now." Nietzsche studied him, weighing the offer. Around them, the morning wind whispered through pine boughs, carrying the scent of snow. Finally, the chief nodded once, sharply. "You will ride in the center, watched always. One wrong move—" "I understand," Mateo said simply. Within the hour, the great caravan began moving through the snow-laden valley. 300 riders spread out in a living river of horses, weapons, and supplies. Mateo rode on his own mount, 4 warriors keeping close watch. Tawa, still weak but improving, rode nearby on a gentle pony, wrapped warmly in furs. The day grew long as they picked their way through the winter landscape. Snow crunched under hooves, and breath steamed in the cold air. Mateo remained alert, aware of the many eyes watching his every move. He had almost forgotten what it felt like to travel with others after so many years alone. Near midday, Tawa's pony stumbled on hidden ice. The boy swayed dangerously in his saddle, still not fully recovered from his fever. Without hesitation, Mateo guided his horse alongside, steadying both boy and pony with quiet words and sure hands. The watching warriors exchanged glances, noting his skilled horsemanship and gentle touch. "You speak well to horses," Grey Wolf commented, riding closer, like one who has spent many years in their company. Mateo nodded. They ask only honest treatment. Same as people, I reckon. As evening approached, the caravan made camp in a sheltered valley. Fires bloomed in the gathering dark, and the smell of cooking meat drifted on the wind. Though still under guard, Mateo was allowed to sit at one of the larger fires. Tawa insisted on staying near him, much to the consternation of some warriors. The night deepened, and voices rose in song. Ancient melodies floated skyward with the sparks, telling stories of battles and hunts, of great deeds and deeper sorrows. Mateo listened, letting the unfamiliar words wash over him. The rhythms stirred something in his memory. Sunday mornings in a white-painted church, his wife's clear voice lifted in hymns, his small son trying to follow the tune. The familiar ache of loss pressed against his chest, sharper now than it had been in years. In his isolation, he had numbed himself to such feelings. But here, surrounded by family bonds he had long denied himself, the loneliness cut deep. He stared into the flames, remembering other fires, other songs, other gatherings now lost to time. Tawa touched his arm gently. "You are sad," the boy said in careful English. Mateo managed a small smile. "Just remembering, boy. Sometimes memories bring their own kind of hurt." The child nodded with surprising wisdom. "My grandfather says memories are like stars. They shine brightest in the dark times." Around them, the Apache continued their songs, the melody rising and falling like waves. Warriors who had demanded Mateo's death that morning now nodded respectfully when their eyes met his. They had seen him ride all day without attempting escape, watched him help one of their own without hesitation. Such actions spoke louder than words in their reckoning. As the fire burned lower, Mateo remained awake, surrounded by the sounds of the camp. Horses nickering softly, wood crackling, voices murmuring in conversation. The stars wheeled overhead, bright and cold in the mountain sky. He was still a prisoner in many ways, his fate uncertain. But something had shifted during the day's journey, some small measure of trust earned through quiet courage and honest dealings. The night wind carried the scent of pine and wood smoke, mixing with the ancient songs that still echoed through the camp. Mateo pulled his blanket tighter, feeling the weight of memories and the sharp edge of his long isolation. Yet even in this strange place, under guard among those who might still wish him harm, he felt more connected to life than he had in years. At the Apache winter camp, Mateo settled into the small hide tent they'd given him. It sat within sight of Tawa's family lodge, close enough for the guards to watch his every move. The camp spread through a protected valley, with hundreds of lodges arranged in familiar circles. Smoke from cooking fires rose straight into the crisp morning air. Sarah Callahan visited often, her quiet presence a bridge between worlds. "The council meets today," she explained, settling on a log near Mateo's tent. "Some chiefs remember only betrayal from white settlers. Others see hope in how you helped Tawa." Mateo nodded, working a piece of pine wood with his knife. Shavings curled away, revealing the shape of a small horse. "Ain't much good at waiting," he admitted. "Patience," Sarah counseled. "They must decide this in their own time." She watched his hands move steadily over the wood. "You're good with that knife." "Used to make toys for my boy," Mateo said softly. Then he fell silent, focusing on the carving. Throughout the day, tribal elders gathered in the main council lodge. Their voices rose and fell, sometimes sharp with anger, sometimes thoughtful. Sarah translated bits of what she overheard as she moved through camp. 3 raids on their hunting camps last summer, she told Mateo. Lost good men to settler bullets. The young warriors want blood price. She paused, adjusting her shawl against the cold. But others speak of your endurance at the post, how you rode unbound, helped their chief's son. Tawa's recovery gained strength daily. By afternoon, he sat wrapped in furs outside Mateo's tent, watching the carving take shape. Like my pony, he said, pointing to the wooden horse's emerging features. "That's right," Mateo agreed, carefully working on the mane. "Thought you might like something to remember him by." Other children crept closer, drawn by curiosity about the quiet mountain man. They watched wide-eyed as the wooden horse took form. One small girl offered Mateo a piece of dried fruit. He accepted with a grave nod that made her giggle. "Tell us about the mountains," Tawa urged. More children settled around, waiting. Mateo hesitated, unused to such an audience, but looking at their eager faces, something long frozen began to thaw. He found himself describing the high peaks where mountain goats danced on impossible ledges, the hidden valleys where elk grazed in summer meadows. When he told them about a mother bear teaching her cubs to fish, making his hands dance like clumsy bear paws, surprised laughter escaped him. The sound felt strange in his throat after so many years. The children laughed too, mimicking his bear gestures. Sarah watched from nearby, smiling. "First time I've heard you laugh," she said later, as she brought him a bowl of stew. But the peaceful afternoon shattered when scouts galloped into camp, their horses lathered. They spoke rapidly to Chief Naicha, gesturing toward the eastern passes. Sarah's face grew troubled as she listened. "Soldiers," she translated for Mateo. "3 companies moving this way. They've spotted our smoke." She twisted her hands in her skirt. "They're always suspicious of large gatherings, especially in winter." Naicha strode to Mateo's tent at sunset, his face stern in the fading light. Warriors moved behind him, hands never far from weapons. The chief's English came slow but clear. "My scouts count 150 soldiers. They think we plan war." His dark eyes fixed on Mateo. "If you signal them, if you try to run, you die first. Then your death brings war." Mateo met his gaze steadily. "I gave my word. It stands." Naiche studied him, then nodded once. "We watch always," he warned, before turning away. The camp grew quiet as darkness fell. Extra guards took positions on the ridges, mothers called children inside, and warriors checked their weapons. Mateo sat outside his tent, the finished wooden horse in his hands. Tawa appeared like a shadow, accepting the toy with solemn joy. "Thank you, brother," he whispered, before his father called him back to their lodge. Mateo watched him go, feeling the weight of trust and threat pressing down like the gathering night. The boy's words, "brother," echoed in his mind, warming something long cold. Yet the approaching soldiers cast a long shadow over this fragile peace. He could hear the guards moving in the darkness, watching, waiting. The carved horse had taken shape just as these new bonds had, carefully, one small cut at a time. Now, like the toy, everything balanced on a knife's edge. One wrong move could destroy it all. Dawn broke harsh and clear over the Apache camp. Frost sparkled on lodge poles, and cooking fires sent pale smoke threading into the winter sky. Mateo stood outside his tent, scanning the ridgeline. The air felt sharp in his lungs, carrying that stillness that often came before trouble. A glint of metal caught his eye, sunlight on rifle barrels. Blue-coated figures appeared along the valley rim, their horses stamping in the crusty snow. Without warning or parley, a detachment of cavalry broke from the main group, thundering down the slope toward the camp. Women grabbed children, hurrying them inside lodges. Warriors melted into defensive positions, weapons ready, but held low. Mateo's heart pounded as he recognized the officer leading the charge, Captain Henry Barrett, known for his harsh dealings with tribes. The cavalry unit reined up hard at the camp's edge, horses blowing steam in the cold. Captain Barrett sat tall in his saddle, brass buttons gleaming. His voice carried sharp across the clearing. "Release the white man immediately. We know you hold him captive." Chief Naiche stepped forward, his face darkening at the insult. "He stays by choice," he answered in careful English. "We do not hold prisoners here." "Lies!" Barrett's hand moved to his holster. First you gather in numbers, now you take hostages. I know your kind, plotting war while speaking peace." Matteo moved quickly between them, hands raised. "Captain, there's no trouble here. I came willingly." "Stand aside, Hale," Barrett cut him off, not even looking his way. "These savages have addled your mind. We'll sort this out back at the fort." Sarah Callahan pushed through the growing crowd, her shawl flying. "Captain Barrett, please listen. There's been a misunderstanding. Mr. Hale saved the chief's son from death. He's here as a guest, not a prisoner." But Barrett's attention had shifted to the armed warriors emerging from behind lodges. His men tensed, rifles lifting. "Drop your weapons," he barked, "or we'll consider this resistance." Nietzsche's warriors raised bows and rifles in answer. The air crackled with tension as both sides took aim. Mothers hustled the last children inside, and old men shook their heads at the foolishness of it all. "No!" Tawa's young voice rang out. He broke free from his minder's grasp and ran to Matteo, grabbing his hand. "He is my brother. He saved me when I was lost." The boy's grip was fierce, his other hand clutching the wooden horse Matteo had carved. Barrett sneered. "The word of a child means nothing. These people are known liars." "That's enough." Sarah stepped directly in front of Barrett's horse. "I am a witness. I've been here through it all. Mr. Hale nearly died proving his innocence to the Apache. He has earned their trust, and you are destroying weeks of peace-building with your accusations." The captain's face reddened. "Stand aside, woman. This is military business." But Sarah held her ground. "It is God's business, the business of truth and justice. Look around you. Do you see prisoners? Do you see war preparations? Or do you see families, children, a man who built a bridge between peoples?" The winter sun crept across the sky as the standoff stretched through the afternoon. Neither side would lower weapons first. Shadows lengthened across blood-red snow as Barrett and Nietzsche locked eyes, each unwilling to show weakness. Matteo felt Tawa trembling beside him, but the boy wouldn't let go. The wooden horse dug into their clasped palms, a small thing, yet somehow important. Like the toy, trust had been carved slowly, carefully. Now it risked being shattered by one careless moment. Warriors stood stone-faced, arrows nocked. Soldiers' fingers rested on triggers. The sun sank lower, painting everything in crimson light. One wrong move, one nervous twitch, and the valley would explode in violence. Sarah continued moving between groups, speaking softly, reminding each side of what they risked. Her quiet voice carried weight earned through years of faithful service to both peoples. Even Barrett seemed to hear something in her tone that made him pause. The afternoon stretched endless, measured in heartbeats and held breath. Snow began falling again, soft flakes catching the red light like drops of blood. But still they waited, locked in their deadly dance, while the fate of peace hung suspended between raised weapons and winter's gathering dark. The fading light painted long shadows across the snowy ground as tension coiled tighter with each passing minute. A young soldier, nerves frayed by hours of standoff, jerked his rifle skyward. The shot cracked through the evening air like thunder. Chaos erupted. Warriors raised bows, soldiers leveled rifles, and horses danced nervously beneath their riders. Without hesitation, Matteo lunged toward Tawa, wrapping his arms around the boy and shielding him with his body. "Hold your fire!" he shouted, voice raw with desperation. "For God's sake, hold your fire!" Chief Nietzsche barked sharp commands in Apache, his arm thrust out to stay his warriors' arrows. The master of control, he kept his men in check even as fury blazed in his eyes. But Matteo could feel the tension trembling like a drawn bowstring, ready to snap at any moment. Sarah rushed between the groups, her shawl billowing. "Captain Barrett," she called out, "you must pull your men back. One more mistake and we'll have a massacre on our hands." She turned to Matteo, speaking rapidly. "Tell them what you need. I'll translate." Matteo straightened slowly, keeping one protective hand on Tawa's shoulder. Through Sarah, he addressed both leaders. This standoff helps no one. Captain, your men are exhausted and on edge. Chief Nietzsche's warriors won't back down while you threaten their families. Pull back to the valley rim. Give everyone room to breathe. Barrett's face tightened. I have orders to investigate any large gatherings. And you've investigated, Matteo cut in. You've seen there's no war party here. Just families trying to survive the winter. Your presence is turning a peaceful camp into a powder keg. The captain shifted in his saddle, clearly torn between duty and the growing risk of bloodshed. If I withdraw, and something happens, then I'll ride to the fort myself and answer for it, Matteo promised. But right now, you're pushing us all towards something none of us wants. Sarah translated everything, her clear voice carrying across the tense silence. Nietzsche listened intently, his expression grave but considering. After a long moment, he spoke, and Sarah relayed his words. The chief says he will keep his warriors in camp if your soldiers return to the ridge, but any move toward the lodges will be seen as an act of war. Barrett glanced at his nervous troops, then at the lengthening shadows. Finally, he nodded curtly. We'll pull back to the rim, but we'll be watching. He turned his horse, signaling his men to withdraw. The cavalry unit backed away slowly, rifles still ready, until they reached the valley's edge. As darkness settled over the camp, neither side truly relaxed. The Apache posted extra guards, while cavalry campfires dotted the ridgeline like fallen stars. War drums began to pulse from the Apache lodges, their deep rhythms speaking of battles and glory won in ages past. From the soldiers' camp, bugles rang out, their bright notes carrying challenge on the night wind. Matteo sat alone by his fire, watching sparks spiral up toward the stars. The weight of the day's events pressed down on him like a physical burden. For the first time since losing his family, he felt the desperate need for something greater than himself. Slowly, hesitantly, he bowed his head. Lord, he whispered, voice rough with emotion, I know I turned my back on you when Mary and John died. Blamed you for taking them. He paused, struggling with words long unused. But today I saw how close we came to senseless death. These people, Lord, Apache and soldier alike, they're all your children. And that boy? His voice caught as he thought of Tawa's trust. That boy made me remember what it means to care again. The fire crackled softly as Matteo continued his prayer, pouring out years of bottled grief and anger. I'm begging for your help. Show us a way through this without bloodshed. Help me be worthy of the trust these people have placed in me. Tears tracked down his weathered cheeks. And forgive me, Lord, for staying silent so long. The war drums thundered on, and distant bugles answered across the dark valley. But here by the fire, Matteo felt something shift inside him, like a frozen stream beginning to thaw. The prayer had broken a dam he'd built years ago, letting faith flow back into parched places in his soul. He remained by the fire long into the night, keeping vigil as both camps waited anxiously for dawn. The drums never ceased their pulsing rhythms, and every hour the bugles rang out their defiant calls. But Matteo continued praying, his whispered words joining the music of that tense night, asking for mercy in a land that had seen too little of it. Dawn broke over the valley, painting the snow in shades of rose and gold. Matteo stood at his tent's entrance, watching the first light touch the soldiers' camp on the ridge. He hadn't slept. The night's prayers had strengthened his resolve, showing him what needed to be done. Sarah approached, her shawl pulled tight against the morning chill. You look like a man who's made a decision, she said softly. I have. Matteo squared his shoulders. We need to end this standoff before someone's trigger finger gets itchy. I'm going to speak with Nietzsche. He found the Apache chief already awake, conferring with his warriors. Sarah followed, ready to translate. The morning light cast deep shadows across Nietzsche's weathered face as Matteo spoke. Let me stand between the camps, Matteo said, Let me try to make them understand." Sarah translated, her voice carrying the weight of his words. Nietzsche studied Matteo for a long moment, measuring the truth in his eyes. Finally, he nodded. "I will come with you," he said through Sarah. "My son's savior should not face the soldiers alone." They mounted their horses, Sarah joining them. The war drums had fallen silent, but tension still crackled in the crisp morning air. As they rode toward the soldiers' position, Matteo felt hundreds of eyes following them from both camps. Captain Barrett and his lieutenants met them halfway, rifles held ready. The captain's face was drawn from a sleepless night, his patience clearly worn thin. "State your business," he snapped. Matteo drew a steady breath. "I'm here to tell you what really happened. Not what you assume, but the truth of it." He spoke plainly, describing how he'd found Tawa nearly frozen to death, how compassion had moved him to act when fear might have kept his door closed. "I didn't see an Apache child that night," he said, his voice carrying across the silent field. "I saw a boy who needed help just like my own son once did." Some soldiers shifted uncomfortably, but others scoffed. "A likely story," one lieutenant muttered, "probably coaching the savage to—" His words cut off as hoofbeats approached from behind. Tawa rode forward on his pony, still weak but sitting straight-backed with dignity. The boy's voice rang out clear and strong in English, words he'd clearly practiced with Sarah's help. "This man speaks truth," Tawa declared, trembling slightly but holding firm. "When spirits of winter almost took me, he gave me life. He is not captive or enemy." The boy's chin lifted proudly. "He is my brother." The field fell absolutely silent. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Matteo felt something warm and fierce swell in his chest at the boy's courage. Captain Barrett's eyes darted between Tawa and Nietzsche, clearly unsettled by this turn of events. The chief sat his horse like a statue, but his gaze burned into the captain with an intensity that made the soldier shift in his saddle. "You say he saved your life?" Barrett asked Tawa directly, his tone softer now. "Yes." Tawa touched his chest. "He gave me warmth when I was ice, medicine when I was sick, food when I was weak." The boy's voice grew stronger. "He sang to me like my mother does, protected me like my father does." He reached out and gripped Matteo's arm. "Brother." Matteo covered the boy's hand with his own, feeling the truth of that word sink deep into his soul. For years, he'd existed only to survive, letting grief wall him off from human connection. Now, watching Tawa bridge the divide between two worlds with simple, honest words, Matteo understood why God had led that dying child to his door. Sarah spoke up, her quiet voice carrying authority earned through years among both peoples. "Captain, you see the truth before you. There is no threat here, only a man who chose mercy over fear, and a boy brave enough to declare it before all." Barrett's shoulders sagged slightly, the rigid military bearing softening. He looked at Nietzsche, then at Matteo and Tawa, seeing at last what his prejudice had blinded him to before. Not enemies plotting war, but fathers and sons, brothers by choice rather than blood. For the first time since saving Tawa, Matteo felt the full weight of his new purpose. He was no longer just a hermit hiding from his grief in the mountains. Through one act of compassion, God had led him to become something more, a bridge between peoples, a voice for peace when others called for war. The morning sun climbed higher, melting the frost from the grass between the camps. In its warm light, soldiers and warriors alike waited to see what would happen next. As two fathers, a brave boy, and a widow who'd never lost her faith worked to keep peace in a land too familiar with violence. The morning stretched into afternoon as the delicate work of peace continued. Matteo's throat grew hoarse from talking, but he pressed on, knowing lives hung on finding the right words. Captain Barrett stood with his arms crossed, boots planted firmly in the melting snow, while Nietzsche remained astride his horse, face impassive, but eyes alert. Think on it, Captain, Matteo urged, his voice carrying across the space between them. If we meant harm, would we have nursed the boy back to health? Would he defend me so fiercely? Sarah translated his words for Nietzsche, then added her own gentle wisdom. I have lived among these people for years, Captain. They keep their word when treated with respect. The captain shifted his weight, jaw working as he considered. His fingers drummed against his rifle stock, but the weapon remained lowered. The fort expects action against any large gathering, he said finally. They'll want explanations. Then tell them the truth, Matteo replied. Tell them how an Apache chief's son was saved by a settler, and how blood was avoided because we chose to listen instead of shoot. He gestured to Tawa, who sat straight-backed on his pony nearby. Tell them how a child's honesty prevented a war. Barrett's eyes lingered on Tawa, something softening in his stern expression. Perhaps he saw his own son in the boy's brave bearing, or remembered younger days before suspicion had hardened his heart. My men won't like withdrawing, he said slowly. Better wounded pride than wounded bodies, Matteo answered. We've all seen enough death in these mountains. Sarah translated everything for Nietzsche, whose deep voice rumbled in response. The chief says his warriors will hold their peace if your soldiers withdraw first, she relayed. He gives his word as a father. The negotiations continued through the afternoon, each side testing the other's resolve. Matteo felt the weight of lives in every careful word, every translated phrase. His legs trembled with exhaustion, but he forced himself to stand steady. Finally, as shadows lengthened across the snow, Captain Barrett raised his hand in signal. We'll withdraw to the fort, he announced. But make no mistake, we'll be watching. Any sign of trouble? There won't be, Matteo said firmly. Through Sarah, he urged Nietzsche to let his warriors disperse as well, to show good faith. The chief considered, then nodded slowly. Orders were called out in 2 languages. With much grumbling and backward glancing, the soldiers began to mount up. Their horses' hooves churned the melting snow as they formed columns, steel and brass glinting in the late afternoon light. Watching them go, Matteo felt his shoulders sag with relief. Around him, Apache warriors gradually broke into smaller groups, though many remained alert, weapons close at hand. The tension began to bleed away like snow melting in spring. You have done a good thing, Sarah said softly, touching his arm. Few men could have bridged this divide. Matteo could only nod, suddenly too tired for words. He made his way back to his tent, legs unsteady beneath him. The day's strain caught up with him all at once, the hours of careful negotiation, the lives weighing on his conscience, the fear of failure that he'd held at bay until now. He had just sunk onto his bedroll when the tent flap rustled. Tawa slipped inside, moving with the quiet grace of his people. Without a word, the boy settled beside him, small shoulder pressing against Matteo's arm. You stopped the fighting, Tawa said in his careful English, like a true brother would. The simple trust in those words broke something in Matteo's heart. Tears he'd held back for years, grief for his lost son, guilt over his failure to save him, gratitude for this second chance at family, spilled down his cheeks. He tried to turn away, but Tawa wrapped thin arms around his waist. It is good to cry, the boy said softly. My mother says tears water the heart, help it grow strong again. He pressed closer. You are my family now, my brother who came from the mountains. Matteo buried his face in the boy's dark hair, shoulders shaking with silent sobs. How long had he hidden from love, thinking his heart too scarred to heal? Yet here was proof of God's mercy, a child's embrace melting the ice around his soul, making him feel whole again. They sat together as evening settled over the camp, the boy's presence a healing balm. Through the tent walls came the soft sounds of family life, women calling children to supper, men talking in low voices, the peaceful rhythm of a people at rest. Matteo breathed it in, knowing he was no longer alone. The weeks crept by in the mountain valley, each day wrapped in a thick blanket of snow. The white drifts piled high against the lodges, turning the Apache winter camp into a collection of snow-capped peaks beneath the towering Colorado mountains. Mateo found his days filled with purpose now, his hands always busy with work that needed doing. Each morning, he joined the younger men to chop firewood, his axe swinging in rhythm with theirs. The sound of steel biting wood echoed through the crisp air, while good-natured competition sparked between them over who could split the most logs. Though few spoke English and Mateo knew little Apache, the language of honest work needed no translation. When hunting parties went out, they welcomed his skill at tracking. Mateo showed them how to spot elk trails beneath fresh snow, and they taught him their silent hand signals for coordinating the hunt. The meat they brought back fed everyone, and Mateo felt satisfaction in contributing to the community's survival. But it was with the children that the greatest change showed in him. They flocked to the quiet mountain man, especially when he worked on simple crafts near the central fires. His patient hands guided small fingers learning to whittle, showing them how to shape wood safely with small knives. Their laughter melted years of isolation from his face. Sarah Callahan noticed the transformation one afternoon as she passed by. Mateo sat cross-legged among a group of children, demonstrating how to carve a simple bird from pine. His eyes held a warmth she hadn't seen before. "You've changed," she said softly, pausing beside him. "There's light in your face again." Mateo looked up, a slight smile touching his lips. "Reckon these little ones have taught me more than I've taught them." The evenings belonged to Tawa. The boy would slip into Mateo's lodge after supper, eager for stories. They sat close to the fire, working on their whittling, while Mateo's quiet voice filled the space between them with tales of his past life. "My Catherine, she loved spring best," he told Tawa one night, carefully shaping a piece of pine. Said it reminded her that God makes all things new again. His voice grew soft. "Little James was just your age when the fever took them both." Tawa's hand stilled on his own carving. "They live in your heart still," he said with the simple wisdom of children. "Like the eagles that nest in the highest peaks, watching over us." Mateo's throat tightened, but the pain was different now, cleaner somehow, like winter air. These talks with Tawa had begun to heal what he thought would stay broken forever. One evening, as purple dusk settled over the snowy camp, Chief Nietzsche himself appeared at Mateo's lodge. The tall leader ducked through the entrance, his presence filling the small space. Without speaking, he settled beside the fire across from Mateo. In his hands, he held a staff of dark wood, polished smooth and carved with symbols of protection, lightning bolts, eagle feathers, and mountain peaks. With ceremonial gravity, he laid it across Mateo's knees. "You chose mercy when death was easier," Nietzsche said in careful English, his deep voice carrying the weight of formal proclamation. "You protected my son. Now you protect all our children, teaching them gentle ways." He gestured to the staff. "This marks you as guardian among us." Mateo bowed his head, humbled by the honor. His hands traced the carved symbols, feeling the trust they represented. From lonely hermit to protected protector, God's mercy had led him on a path he never could have imagined. The first warm winds of spring whispered through the valley, carrying the promise of change. Patches of earth emerged from beneath the melting snow like islands in a white sea. The drip of water from lodge poles marked time as Mateo packed his few belongings, preparing for the journey back to his cabin. Inside his temporary home, he folded the extra blankets the Apache women had given him, each one telling its own story of kindness. His hands lingered on the rough wool, remembering the nights they had kept him warm through the long winter. The morning light filtered through the lodge covering, casting dancing shadows on the ground. Tawa burst through the entrance, his breath coming quick. "You cannot go." The boy's eyes were wide with worry. "The valley will be empty without you, brother." Mateo knelt before him, placing weathered hands on the boy's shoulders. Your people have been kind to me, but I must tend to my own place. His voice was gentle, though his heart ached at the thought of leaving. Then I will visit you, Tawa declared firmly. Father says you are guardian now. You cannot guard from far away. A shadow darkened the entrance, and Sarah Callahan stepped inside. She carried a small package wrapped in cloth. The boy speaks truth, Mateo. She handed him the bundle, dried herbs and medicines from her own stores. The frontier doesn't need more walls between people. It needs bridges. Mateo accepted her gift, remembering how her translations had helped prevent bloodshed months ago. Ain't sure I know how to be a bridge, he admitted quietly. You already are one, Sarah smiled. Every time you teach the children, every hunt you share with the warriors, every story you tell Tawa, these are the threads that bind people together. Outside, his horse stomped impatiently, loaded with supplies for the ride home. The morning sun had risen higher, warming the air. Mateo shouldered his pack, Chief Nycha's staff secured carefully alongside his rifle. The entire camp gathered to bid him farewell. Warriors who had once threatened his life now clasped his arm in respect. Women pressed packages of dried meat and corn into his saddlebags. Children ran circles around his horse, begging for one last story. Chief Nycha approached last, his bearing regal as always. My son calls you brother, he said. This makes you family. Do not forget. Mateo touched his heart in response, words failing him. As he mounted his horse, the valley spread before him, so different from when he had first arrived. Then, it had been a place of danger and suspicion. Now it felt alive with possibility. The ride home took most of the day. When Mateo finally pushed open his cabin door, the familiar space felt different too. No longer a fortress against the world, but a waypoint between two peoples. He placed Nycha's staff reverently beside the hearth, its carvings catching the last light of day. Lighting his old lamp, Mateo knelt beside his bed. For the first time in years, prayer came easily to his lips, gratitude flowing like a spring stream. In the quiet, he heard Tawa's laughter echo in his memory, saw Sarah's knowing smile, felt the weight of Nycha's trust. I am not alone anymore, he whispered, and knew it was true. Thanks for tuning in. These stories remind us that life is more than headlines. It's about heartlines. Subscribe if you want more moments that make you pause, feel, and reflect.